final panel of a year-long webinar series that we at NYU CSGS have been doing in collaboration with the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University in New Delhi, which is directed by Professor Madhavi Menon. So this series is entitled Theory and Practice, and it places scholars and activists in the US and South Asia in conversation to engage in a truly transnational dialogue in feminist and queer studies. So to my mind, this is one of the few sort of bright spots in that this COVID year has actually enabled, that it's actually allowed us to have these kinds of conversations that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So please do check out our previous webinars in this series. They're all on our website at CSGS NYU, and I believe they're also on the Ashoka website. So this semester's panels have focused specifically on trans bodies and activism and trans studies and activism. So for instance, the previous panel prior to this one was on bodies, sexualities, and the law with Dean Spade, Flavia Agnes, and Rahul Rao. So today's webinar in some ways really continues the conversation that was initiated by that panel. And we're interested today in thinking about trans, both transnationally and transculturally. So some of the questions we asked our panelists to consider are, what are the uses and limits of thinking trans across national borders? I'd love to hear about some of the problems, some of the issues that our panelists have encountered in engaging in this kind of transnational or cross-border work in trans issues. So one of the questions I had for the panelists is, how do questions of language and translation play out in these contexts? And what are the different borders that this category of trans crosses or doesn't cross? And those are borders of nation, of race, of class, of caste, of geography, etc. So these are sort of some of the organizing questions of the panel. And I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. You can find their full bios on our website and in the chat. So we'll first be hearing from C. Riley Snorton. Riley is a professor of English language and literature at the University of Chicago. Riley is the author of 2 monographs, Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low from 2014, and Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity from 2017. Currently, he is co-editing The Flesh of the Matter, a Horton Spiller's Reader, which is forthcoming. And Riley is also the co-editor of GLQ, a journal of gay and lesbian studies. Next, we'll hear from Shayan Bhattacharya. Shayan is a PhD candidate and queer activist in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. Shayan's doctoral work investigates the role of memory in the way transgender and queer rights are articulated in India. And finally, we're thrilled to have with us Anindya Hajra, who is a trans feminist, transgender rights and social justice activist based in Calcutta, India. In 1998, Anindya co-founded Pratyay Gender Trust, a community-led collective that focuses on transgender persons' right to work, to economic justice, and to inclusion. Anindya works on the collectivization of transgender persons across India, on advocating with policymakers, and on building connections across other human rights movements. So as you can see, our panelists today work on transformations in very disparate geographic, disciplinary, and institutional frames. They span anthropology and literature, India and the US, academia and activism. So we're very specifically putting these 3 scholars and activists in conversation with one another because we're hoping we can really think through how trans travels across these different frames. So just to give you a sense of the logistics here, the event will last 1 hour, so it's quick. We begin with opening statements from the panelists, each of whom will speak for no more than 10 minutes. Then I'll moderate a discussion between the 3 panelists for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes. So if you do have a question for the panelists, please feel free to post it at any time in the Q&A function rather than in the chat function. The audience questions will be fielded by our colleagues from Ashoka, Shiv Sharma and Neil Sengupta. So thank you to both of them in advance. And thanks also to our co-sponsor of today's events, NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute. So please help me in welcoming Riley, Cheyenne, and Anindya. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Riley. Thanks, Riley.
Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. And I also want to thank the many people and academic units who are making this event possible. I'm so glad to be in conversation and looking forward to engaging with and learning from my panelists and you all. When I received the invitation to participate in this dialogue under the heading of trans bodies and cultures, and particularly to think about the uses and limitations of thinking and theorizing trans across national borders, I immediately thought about the power of the prefix and of what might be possible by reworking the question and title of Kwame Anthony Apia's noted 1991 essay, Is the Post and Postmodern, the Post and Postcolonial, into a question for trans? That is the trans and transgender, the trans and transnational? As Apia reveals in his essay, post as an indication of a temporal break carries unevenness and insufficiencies as it's used to index a break from the past and an indication of emergent structures of feelings. Returning to his essay, I was also struck by how he turns to the art market and aesthetic evaluations of African art to ground and illustrate his claims. So whereas post is meant to indicate something about time, trans is often used to indicate something about space. As a prefix, trans indicates movement, of going across. That certainly exceeds the way it affixes and it transforms systems of gender designation. As Susan Stryker, Paisley Curra, and Lisa Jean Moore argue, neither gender nor any of the other suffixes of trans can be understood in isolation. In their reading of trans as a concept that encompasses categorical crossings, leakages, and slips of all sorts, Stryker, Curra, and Moore offer the notion of doubly trans to describe certain modes of inquiry that, while referencing transgender, move beyond the narrow politics of gender identity. In the research I conducted for Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, I begin by thinking about how modern gender is a racial construct, a colonial formulation, such that tracking the movement between trans as a prefix and trans as it attaches to transgender personhood is a racial narrative. The title, Black on Both Sides, is a play on trans as a prefix to indicate that trans cannot escape Blackness. That is, if trans is meant to be a bridge across something, it remains Black on both sides. The book takes as its archive an eclectic collection of materials, including late 19th sexological texts, plantation medical records, fugitive slave narratives, Afro-modernist literary productions, films, and mid-20th century journalistic accounts of Black trans people to demonstrate how race figures prominently in the development of the category of transgender. And in viewing the interplay of Blackness and transness as transitive, which in the grammatical sense refers to an expression of action that requires a direct object to complete its sense of meaning, but also as it refers to the quality of passing into another condition, changeable, changeful, passing away, transient, transitory. The study begins by tracing the circulation of Black and trans as associated signs as they are brought into the same frame by the various ways they've been constituted as fungible, which is to say thingified and interchangeable within the logics of transatlantic exchange. As a gesture toward one apparent convergence of transgender and transnational, the term fungible, according to its etymology, first appeared in English language in Henry Colebrook's Treatise on Obligations and Contracts, Part 1 in 1818. Colebrook, having spent a considerable period of his life as a colonial bureaucrat and judge in India, returned to England to write about the particularities of British contract law. He also wrote about Hinduism and Hindu philosophy before his death in 1871. Fungible articles, which he described according to their characteristic quantifiability, alike liquidate and exigible, required legal definition in relations to matter of compensation. Yet Colebrook maintains even things which are not fungible may be subjects of compensation, being due under general obligation, respectively, as cattle, slaves, horses. The legal treatment of slaves and animals as both subjects of compensation and not fungible indicates, at least in part, the anxiogenic time in which the treatise was produced. So as a matter of language in English, one transitivity between race and gender is expressed through the transnational colonial underpinnings. And I'm thinking here also of Lisa Lowe's important work on intimacies of four continents, of the very language meant to make coherent a paradox of rendering people as property. This also informs another way of thinking about the itineracy of transness, that is, the transness of transness, in terms of how race and gender constitute collateral genealogies, or transversalities sedimented by entangled colonial histories of labor extraction, caste, enslavement, racial capitalism. To draw upon a much more contemporary example, I've been moved and subsequently have been shifting my thinking as it appeared in the book, and as a result of witnessing the global uprisings in the summer of 2020 for Black Lives Matter and the global movement for Black Lives in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, particularly as it relates to the unevenness and insufficiency, to harken back to Apia, of attending to the death of Tony McDade, a Black trans man murdered by the Tallahassee, Florida police just days after international news of Floyd's death at the hands of Minneapolis, Minnesota police, and the beating of Ayanna Dorr, a Black trans woman who was harmed by passersby going to a gas station in Minneapolis, just days after Floyd's death. These tragic events have been making me think about the limitations of normative ways of understanding and valuing trans personhood. And while I maintain that trans is not reducible to its medicalization or even to identification, I wonder if non-binarity, particularly as I've been fortunate to have been involved in more conversations in other national and cultural contexts, can differently hold what it would mean to think about racialized gendered entanglement. This is leading me to a project about swamps. As a place that's neither land nor water, but both, the swamp functions as the material ground, as the terra infirma, for a series of considerations about difference, about change, time, life, and death. As another place that has no sense of nation. And alongside that, to draw on Monique Elworth's definition, the swamp is a site of entanglements that disable taxonomies, distinguishing the human from the animal, from the vegetable, from the atmospheric, revealing an assemblage of interpenetrating forces. My interest is moving away from liminality towards non-binary as a way of thinking about multiplicity, transformation, and deviation, both in terms of places and beings. And the first way I've been approaching this is in terms of form, that something happens to form materially and conceptually in the swamps. As Elworth and others have argued, swamp ecologies disrupt a particular kind of colonial ordering on which form, in the form of the subject or print culture or territory, resides. It is the aliveness of the swamp that is confounding. That is, one might say, life disorganizes form as it also proliferates it, making illegible forms and form illegible, if only for a moment. This sensitizes my reading of the swamp as a Black thing, in terms of Denise Ferreira da Silva's definition, as that rare and obsolete definition of matter, as substance without form. I'm interested in thinking about Blackness not in terms of category, but in terms of matter. And relatedly, in terms of what the appearance of Blackness seems to remediate about the question of freedom interrupted and about the temporalities of life and death. That is, and as da Silva points, as a method for study and unbounded sociality, Blackness as matter signals another world which exists without time and out of space in the plenum. Perhaps saying without time and out of space is another way of expressing what it means to live in the now. And perhaps in thinking ecologically, we might grasp towards an unburdening of history, of playing in the mud, which is to say, to refuse the formal techniques of classification and to move toward the non-binary, which we may already inhabit. I'm keenly aware of the danger here in the supposition and perhaps also in the desiring for such an unburdening. But perhaps in thinking with the swamps and with non-binary as a mode of being, we might index a different system of value or a different way of valuing being and things without space and out of time to post the trans and trans the post. Indeed, another world one in which the terms of racial and gender knowledge are made anew, a way of honoring the dead, a way of doing time, living and learning with ghosts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riley. That was beautiful. Very excited to talk to you more about that. Okay, let's move to Cheyenne.
Thanks a lot, Professor Gopinath. Thank you for organizing this, Ashoka, NYU, and it's really intimidating speaking after Professor Snorton, but I'll try. Addressing the United Nations General Assembly for its 75th anniversary in 2020, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi asked, how long should the world's largest democracy wait before it can have a more decisive role in the UN? And to justify India's bid for a more powerful spot in the UN, he underlined India's COVID vaccine distribution among developing nations, its robust foreign policy, fast-growing digital market, among other features. While the veracity of these claims is beyond the purview of my short comments today, but what is interesting is to note that the Prime Minister concluded his catalogue of India's achievements by stating that India gives 26 weeks paid maternity leave and that India had brought legal reforms to accord rights to transgender citizens. While on many platforms, Modi invokes a phallic India that enters enemy territory and vanquishes it, on the UN stage, India seemed like a benign patriarch that is a protector of global health, would-be mothers, and the so-called gender minority. Following Rahul Rao and Akshay Khanna, one witnesses a masculinist state staging its forward march towards global power in deeply gendered terms. However, even as Modi instrumentalizes transgender rights as India's stake to global recognition, the law that he invoked, the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019, has been rejected by most of India's trans communities. The law lays the grounds for the governmentalization of trans and hijra lives through complex bureaucratic processes that will decide if a person can receive transgender certification, which is then tied to eligibility for access to welfare. Moreover, if a trans person chooses to identify in the gender binary, they have to show evidence of medical intervention that violates a Supreme Court verdict that had stated trans identification should be based on only self-determination. This act criminalizes hijra kinship networks and equates traditional hijra labor practices like begging as bonded labor, and seeks to rescue and rehabilitate the gender non-conforming by placing them in state shelter homes or in the custody of their natal families, both of which have been repeatedly proven to be the most oppressive sites of violence for the non-normative. In all these measures, what we witness is containment, capture, incarceration, the creation of violent borders around what trans is and what it should be. Additionally, given how the state headed by a Hindu majoritarian government keeps going back to Hindu myths to extol scriptural sanction of gender nonconformity, a rigid version of transness is tethered to a Hindu nationalist ideology. The government constituted a national council for transgender persons that will ostensibly oversee trans welfare. Most of the trans representatives on this council are not only from the dominant castes, but they all explicitly supported the law and the government's majoritarian policies. Grace Banu, Dalit rights activist and founder of the Trans Rights Now, points out in an interview with a news portal, all of them in the council have expressed support for the ruling party. Is that why they have been chosen? Borders are being drawn between nationalist, anti-nationalist, asli, nakli, or fake, authentic, which means that while one body gets imbued with rights, the rest remain rightless. In order to be the authentic subject of trans rights, one has to adhere to a fixed repertoire of behaviors. And here I'm drawing from Rachel's work on coercive mimesis, where these fixed repertoire of behaviors would include loyalty towards the Hindu state, its narrative of nationalism, and what it deems as the right kind of trans body. It cannot be a mere coincidence that this law premised on capture was notified just 2 days after the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, was notified. The CAA is explicitly a faith-based law that is supposed to give Indian citizenship to persecuted religious minorities from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, namely Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians. The blatant Islamophobia of this law has to be read in conjunction with the National Register of Citizens, NRC, that will require Indians to show legacy documents to prove their citizenship. The Modi government intends to sieve the citizens from the infiltrators. The NRC has already been implemented in the northeastern state of Assam that shares its border with Bangladesh, where 1.9 million people, mostly Dalit and Muslims, have lost citizenship. Included among these people were also 2,000 trans people. It is but obvious that for those who are more often than not forced out of their natal families, it will be impossible to procure any documents that prove their family's presence in this country. However, the CAA is supposed to accommodate those non-Muslims left out of the NRC back into the Hindu nation's fold. So then what about Muslim trans persons? Scholars and activists like Revati, Gayatri Reddy, Vaibhav Saria, Anidatta have noted the syncretism of Hijra-like worlds where Islamic rituals coexist with Hindu ones. This is not to argue that these spaces exist outside of caste, but that there is also mobility across castes and faiths, a mobility so powerful that it makes the state anxious. And hence the laws that I've just briefly mentioned here draw borders of legality to restrict such mobility. Yet this attempt at capture is always already incomplete, because even as the state tries to control what trans is, it cannot capture what trans does. So just want to conclude my brief comments with two images. This first one, and excuse me for the grainy quality of the image, this is a screen grab from a video on a news portal. And before I talk about this image, the brief context to this image is that the people of Thoothukudi in Tamil Nadu, a state in southern India, had been protesting against a copper smelting plant for several months because it was leading to various skin diseases, including skin cancer, and they demanded its closure. And I'm talking about the year 2018. On May 22nd, 2018, in a ghastly incident of police firing, 13 protesters were shot dead. This image is from a protest by trans women in Chennai, the capital city of Tamil Nadu, who were protesting this mass shooting. Trans women and their friends laid on the roads personifying dead bodies while the rest cried and sang in protest and mourning. They were performing opari, a folk performance tradition of mourning, lamentation, eulogy. And, like, of course, looking at like this personification of a dead body, one of course thinks of ACT UP and Black Lives Matter. There's a long genealogy of using public space and using death. Now, trans people had been involved in the Sterlite the copper smelting plant protests right from the start. I'm invoking this protest to not simply signal an intersectional moment of solidarity between different social movements. And just as Professor Norton was invoking Susan Stryker, Parsley Kura, and Legion Moore, if we keep their formulation of trans as a prefix in mind, which enables all kinds of crossings, leakages, and slips of all sorts, then perhaps for me, this image really asks us what trans does to the environment, what trans does to gender, what does it do to geopolitics, what does it do to our protest archives, most importantly, what does it do to space, time, and the very idea of critique. And the second image, Shiv. Shiv, are you there?
Yes, we'll just get it up.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, so this image is, this person is Babaida, who has adopted me as her niece. In her youth, Babaida, I'll talk briefly about the time when I took this image, but before that, in her youth, Babaida used to songs of Helen, the iconic Indo-Burmese artist whose seductive dance numbers and acrobatics in Hindi films from the late 1950s to the early 1980s were an essential ingredient of any Hindi superhit movie. And Babaida was a very popular performer in Kolkata's, the city in Eastern India. She was a very popular dancer in Kolkata's bars, and this is one of her many Helen poses. I took this image shortly after she refused to accept a sari that was being given by a non-profit distributing clothes and rations among trans persons. Incidentally, this non-profit was also a vociferous supporter of the Trans Act. Now, Babaida's femininity refused the easy trope of sari for trans women and shirt and trousers for trans men. She demanded that she be given a round-necked tee. It was this image, I took this image right after she refused to accept the sari. So, but I'm not arguing that Babaida represents some radical utopic ideal of gender transgression that can dismantle the enclosures of law, because the choice of her clothes is also determined by how she navigates the neighborhood she lives in, the public transport that she takes every day as an arthritic patient. Yet, what is striking, that a Helen pose can be embodied in a simple vest, old glasses, and short hair. If this is not a trans line of flight, what else is? Thank you.
Fantastic, Shayan. This is such important work. There's so much in what you said. It's wonderful. So let's move on to India, and then we'll have our conversation.
Thank you to Gayatri, to Professor Snowton, to Ashoka University, and thank you for laying the ground. Both of you have spoken before me. So I'm going to read out something that I have written. It was sometime in late August 2012, about 9 months before he were to pass away, that one of India's most prominent filmmakers, Rituparna Ghosh, released what was to become their last completed film. The film was called Chitrangada, based loosely on a song dance drama written by Rabindranath Tagore in 1892. A story, the story being of a princess who was raised as a prince to fulfill a divine prophecy that, queerly enough, hadn't materialized. In the film, Rituparno dwells into the character played by their self of a dancer who wishes to undergo a gender reaffirmation surgery. This was the third film in which Rituparna was playing trans queer character roles, and their first and the only film, ironically, that they directed in this genre. Towards the end of the film, the character played by Rituparno decides, pretty much from the hospital bed itself, not to proceed with the gender reaffirmation by calling off the surgery. In one of my earliest conversations with the director, post the release of Chitrangada, the film, this moment where the character played by them calls off the surgery, I complained how it dealt a body blow to the lived experiences and struggles of trans and gender non-conforming individuals. How this depiction in the film by someone as influential and popular a film director as Rituparna was, and who by then had acquired an almost towering totem-like presence for the larger Koti trans queer communities in India, and specifically in Bengal, for projecting their trans queer appearance in chat shows and television programs and film award events, with a regularity and intensity not seen in the history of Indian television at least, if not in the predominantly masculinist world of filmmaking. Our conversation did not go anywhere. Rituparna did not resist my dissent and rage at this feeling of being let down, a feeling of slight betrayal their film generated in me at that point of time. We had a brief exchange on the film a few months later when I had conveyed to them a message from a trans queer friend who was extremely moved by the film, and Rituparna mocked me in jest, saying, "Would you now admit that the film wasn't so bad after all?" Before we could unpack the film again by revisiting that part where the central character rescinds the decision to continue the gender transitioning, Rituparna passed away, leaving behind an unfinished conversation. A year after their death, the collective that I am part of decided to begin an annual lecture series in the memory of Rituparna Ghosh. I wish to talk about this. Since 2014 until last year, the 7 years of what is the Rituparna Ghosh Memorial Lecture has seen a diverse range of speakers, and in one instance, a performance where it did not replace but became the lecture. We have had a women's rights lawyer, 2 journalists, both winners of the Magsaysay Award, one who writes insightful views on agriculture, caste, media, and the other who's known to be one of India's most influential journalists. We have had a feminist scholar, an author who's a critique of Brahmanical Hinduism and the insidious proliferation of dominant caste injustice for decades. We have staged an iconic play with the theme of military occupation in a northeastern state in India and the nature of state violence on women's bodies, played by a doyen of Indian theatre. And lastly, a labor historian and activist tracing the fragmented trajectory of a transgender person's complex relationship with labor in the context of Indian labor history. The choice of speakers for this memorial lecture has been peculiar. We have been questioned for steering clear of having even a single trans queer speaker till date. As a trans feminist organization, what has been our rationale for this? I will return to this question perhaps when we have a discussion. Let me here read out instead what performance studies scholar Trina Nilina Banerjee writes in her introduction to the translated text of an interview of Savitri Hesnam following the performance of the play Draupadi in the lecture in 2017. She writes, the decision to invite the staging of Draupadi, not in lieu of, but as the Rituparna Ghosh Memorial Lecture, brought several incisively critical political positions to the fore. One, of course, was the politics of resistance that the play itself had continued to uphold for close to 2 decades. Second, as a demonstration of Trothoi's politics, it was to continue to stress at several points before and after the performance that neither of us, no matter where we are and what our individual positions, can afford to be invested in single issue politics. Therefore, the expectation that an organization invested in the politics of sexuality and gender identity would not be concerned with questions of state violence, democracy, and military law was an ill-founded expectation. It cannot be stressed enough that the same causes that drove a person to desire freedom of sexually marginalized identities in this society would also impel her to passionately desire the freedom of the other who was routinely violated by the state's imperialist machinery. Last, and most importantly, in asserting the fact that the performance was the lecture, the organization took me back to one of the most important political lessons that I drew from the discipline that I teach, that is performance studies. It is also a lesson that I learned closely from observing and listening to my teacher, Kanhailal Haisnam. Performance is not simply something that you can, as a scholar, make notes out of, describe, or write books about. Performance is not merely an object of knowledge. Performance in itself is a way of knowing. It is a mode of experiential, bodily knowledge that often remains untranslatable to and incommensurable with other modes of discursive textual knowledge. Pierre Nora had once written of how sites of memory or the places of intentional forced commemoration become essential only when the living environments of memory have begun to disappear. Unlike duty memory that is often harnessed from above in the interest of the nation state and its institutional representatives, living memory allows for the possibility of loss, permits forgetting, and yet keeps alive a rich repertoire of cultural resources that can be passed on from one generation to the next through processes of embodied transmission. Here, the body becomes a living site of memory. It does not seek to memorialize and mourn that which is gone, but keeps us connected to an eternal present, enriched by dynamic cultural performances, narratives, games, songs, and anecdotes. In environments such as these, culture is not a museum of fixed and dated objects, but a palpable, living, and breathing force. If we look at the timeline, say, of the last 7 to 10 years that roughly coincides with the lectures coming into being, aspects of ourselves as trans bodies, as trans persons. And here I'm conscious of the easy collapses that this identity could and does bring about, as Professor Norton and also Shan has spoken. As a trans feminist organization, we're deeply concerned about the borders that we inhabit, that we embody, and that which is transcribed on us. We are interested in examining the idea of self-determination as it is being given to us by the court, as it is being interpreted by the bureaucracy, by the state, by the nation state. The limits of self-determination, as Shan refers to, um, the governmentality around self-determination, and what it has come to become, its tropes. We're interested in the political economy of transness and its politics. I will end here by showing a very small clip from the last year's lecture in which we tried to historically locate the fragmented experience of trans persons to that of labor, with a specific viewing of their location within the rich labor history concerning jute mills in West Bengal in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The speaker is an environment and labor rights activist and historian, Nabodotto. And in this specific clip, he's responding to the question of the legitimacy of trans persons' labor, a question that was posed to him, on what is considered as work and the morals that are surrounding it. I think I've sort of stepped beyond my time limit. I'll stop here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this, but yeah, so yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anindya. We'll absolutely pick up on that. So thank all three of you for absolutely brilliant, incredibly rich presentations. I wish we had more time, but the one thing that really strikes me is, Riley ended by evoking the swamp, as the space of non-classification. And I think, as Riley put it, we can think about it as the swamp allows us to think about non-binary as a mode of being, right? And I really love that phrase. And then Cheyenne, you said, I really love the idea that you're focusing and want us to think about what trans is, what trans does rather than what trans is. And so, and I think in India, you're also suggesting the work that trans does, right? Rather than these kind of sedimented state classifications of what trans is. So all of you in different ways are pushing against these kind of statist the statist governmentality that defines trans. It also strikes me that, and India, this came out so powerfully in your presentation, that, you're going to performance as precisely that place that rejects those classificatory imperatives. Xian, you also went to performance, both in the copper smelting plant activist performance on the street, and then in your friend's gesture of evoking Helen, right? So that whole repertoire of queer, a kind of queer archival memory that they're sort of evoking in precisely that simple gesture. So, I guess one of the things I want us to, I'd love to hear you say more about is precisely, as Xian mentioned, the ways in which we're focusing or we're trying to get to what trans does rather than what trans is. And, in India, I think the lecture series is a great example of what trans does, right? But can we kind of work with that formulation that Xian gave us and sort of expand on that? Riley, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. And apologies if you're hearing any sort of ambient noise. I think there's some construction going on in my building right now. I love this question, and I'm really just trying to still wrap my mind around it as I am also taking in Cheyenne and Anindya's offerings. I think in one sense, if I were to ground it back in the project that I'm conceptualizing about the swamp, one of the things that's so fascinating to me about swamps as well is to make use of the language that Sylvia Wynter has given us, that like there's something about the unimaginable and the uninhabitable that sit alongside each other. And as so many of the kind of common threads across our presentations invoke, there's a real material sense of why a kind of project of recognition and inclusion is actually quite prohibitive for the being and doing of trans lives. And so, to kind of sit with like the doing of transness, which, in the case of so many policies cropping up in state legislatures in the US that are about prohibiting certain modes of doing transness based on in some ways, I think based on transness being legible for this kind of legal prosecution. I think that this is the kind of in a kind of more legal framework. It's about thinking how do we engage in a space of decriminalization that enables something like the doing and a free doing that may not map onto some sort of legible forms of trans identification. And this is also precisely what interests me about the swamp as a kind of space of lawlessness, according to the ways it has been unable to be mapped by certain kinds of colonial modes of ordering.
Thank you. Sean, do you want to say a few words? That's your formulation that we're using.
I think one thought that I've been having is that at some points, and this could sound a little provocative, but at some points, I think liberal and left imaginaries almost come together when it comes to the question of gender identity. Like there are certain preset expectations that you all only need a representation on the table, or you all only need a toilet, and maybe you all only demand your rations, and that's all you need. And while I was writing this, like the state where I am currently, West Bengal, it's going through its elections. So every political party is writing its manifestos for the elections. And it's very interesting to read those documents, right? So, a left party invited queer and trans people to talk. And it was really a very funny, but also a really telling moment where at one point a trans friend asked this this leader that we will come, but what is for lunch? And he was totally thrown off because we are doing you a huge favor by giving you this space. And so this expectation, so that like thinking of trans as a verb is this constant active agitational negotiation that goes on, that don't think that we are going to be grateful to you because you're just giving us some kind of a sentence in your manifesto, or you are going to give us a shelter home. But not only are we going to question you where at the place where you have invited us, but we are going to demand at times, which almost sounds impossible, but that idea of impossible is also that line, that flight of imagination, because living every day is also sometimes an act of impossibility, but through performance, through voice cadences of speech, that is rendered possible every day.
That's so beautifully put. Thank you. And India, do you have anything more to add?
Well, very briefly, maybe. I think I will just go back to the conversation I was having with a trans activist friend from North Bengal yesterday, and she incidentally was at the meeting which I just referred to, at the meeting that was called by the left. And I mean, in fact, we visited her, something that had triggered her in the meeting that particular day, which was around this constant usage of the language of marginality to describe and evoke transness. And she had, on that particular day, really sort of had come out extremely strongly, saying that she does not identify with this almost this fetish that is made of trans bodies, of a certain kind of precarity, which is not to say that she does not recognize that precarity that sort of exists in trans lives, but to constantly evoke that in and which is also sort of evoked by the state. You see, if you look at the multiple drafts of the stages through which the current legislation has been reached, you would see there are these extremely tokenistic and extremely violent ways of reframing what a trans person or a trans persons could be. I mean, definitions like neither male nor female, either male or female, which this state and has kind of had the gall to kind of put in paper, and also reject summarily the outrage, the collective outrage that many trans persons and communities had voiced. So yeah, so those would be my reflections.
Fantastic, thank you. So we just have 10 minutes for a whole bunch of questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Neil and Shiv to take us through at least some of them.
Thank you so much for what has been a rich conversation. And let me say personally, it's an absolute joy to hear and learn from you all. So a question goes, a major trans narrative is the decentralization of the trans body and foregrounding the ways trans culture is created through kinships, through food, through music and literature. What can we learn? Can we learn from this politically? And what does it imply, perhaps, for queer feminist trans politics? And if you would, perhaps all of you can do this.
Neil, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I lost it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Should I speak more closely? Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's more that I couldn't quite grasp it conceptually.
Okay, sorry, I'll repeat. So a major trans narrative is the decentralization of the trans body and foregrounding the ways trans culture is created, for example, through kinships, through food, through music and literature. Can we learn from this politically? And what does it imply for queer, feminist, and trans politics? To shift away from the body and towards the creation of the trans culture and what that politics might mean.
Got it. Yeah. Do any of you have responses to that? I mean, I think that what the question is doing is sort of centralizing trans cultural production and the centrality of that.
Well, I think that part of this too is like, or what I'm hearing in the question as well, which is about, not only like, what does it mean to think collective, that like the kind of project of locating the trans individual is a potentially dangerous one, but to also think about like how it is that like trans survival, trans joy is cultivated in collective experience through modes of being with each other, both in ordinary ways and in the kind of production of cultural material. And certainly, I think that kind of maps onto a number of social movements that also are deeply nurtured by and shaped by the kind of cultures of communities coming together that produce those kinds of social movements. So I appreciate the question as also an invitation to kind of think about and value the kind of politics of what are seemingly kind of ordinary or the kind of culture politic divide that we actually must think much more richly and robustly about how those how cultural production is a kind of political work, and that and that politics, especially ones that might be more narrowly focused as institutional gains, are perhaps not the ones that nurture the worlds that we want to create with each other, which I think are deeply about cultural shifts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why Xian's evocation of that moment of that gesture of Helen was so beautiful to me, because it spoke precisely to the different modes that the political takes within a trans frame, right, or a queer frame. So any other thoughts from the panelists on that?
So I just wanted to, I mean, this just brought back memories of sort of my work with trans masculine communities in the Northeast. And I mean, I'm conscious of when I'm using these identity terms as a kind of, as a descriptor, because I am aware of the fact that some of these terminologies do not have any resonances at the ground level. And that is precisely also the conversation that I was having with my friend last night, is how do these words begin to define us and sort of ascribe a meaning to us. And for those of us who do not have access to these terms, both that operates both nationally as well as transnationally, and what are our relationships therefore, and how does it kind of complicate us in terms of when the state is now sort of has this mechanism of surveillance, which is constantly played out on trans bodies around who is the authentic trans subject and who is therefore entitled to these benefits, what have you. So in the Northeast, for example, a lot of trans persons, gender non-conforming persons who are assigned gender female at birth or identify as being trans masculine in a range of ways. And that's the most important thing, that they identify being as trans masculine in this very diverse and often contradictory ways. That's the fun and beauty of it, I thought. And they had what the ways and means of getting together was these picnics, spaces where they would sort of go out into the woods and sort of have and cook food and be together and sort of and take some of their girlfriends along, and many of them even till date sort of actively lead these domestic lives in full public view and presence without a sort of a kind, that kind of special focus that is brought onto themselves. It's that everyday lived life, and I think for all of us who have been through these phases of identifying and then sort of becoming state subjects in so many ways, this has also been our it has been our dilemma as to how much of ourselves do we kind of lend to the state for it to kind of have form policies, etc., around our lives with. And it's what happens is something is lost in this translation, and what really happens is that there's only a part of us that gets gets documented or gets taken up within policy work, and the part that gets left behind is something that is that we do not know what to do with, in the sense that trans persons have this is often a thing that we did not kind of, our gender nonconformity, our resistance to sort of getting defined in the way that the state would like to get us defined was something that we held so dearly. In this struggle to get recognized by the state, that has somehow taken a backseat. I mean, somehow we are all in this competition, in this race to get recognized, and the dichotomy between getting recognized and willing to be de-recognized in sort of in being in that space where we are not defined by these regimented structures is something that is very interesting for many of us.
So I see we're almost out of time, but I want to give Shayan the last word. Would you like to say something?
I think I'll just end with the idea of pedagogy, because there was this question on the transnational of trans, and so during my coursework, when I was teaching in my department what is called the Trans Studies Now course, I think for me the biggest challenge in a completely white classroom was to decenter trans narrative, which simply fixates on dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I was doing is that we didn't have a lot to read, but we just had 3 books. So we were reading Black on Both Sides along with Toby Buchan's work on surveillance. And then we were also reading a lot of memoirs, Revati and Living Smiley Vidya, and then bringing it all together in a sort of seeming chaos, but also encouraging students to think and also imagining another season of Pose for one of the characters. So bringing it all together, so like you can't separate the joy from the frustration, from the hope, from the skepticism, from the rage. So it's everything, humor and shade, everything comes together, right? So to challenge this very hegemonic imaginary of what minority is, but instead of moving towards a minoritarian politics, where we are constantly challenging all kinds of categories and saying that you might have a particular narrative from a particular text today, but it also means that there are a whole lot of other meanings that might just be foreclosed to you. So then you must be questioning, like, why are you experiencing those foreclosures? So what is this opacity about this particular text that you're not being able to understand? So this question of why is this narrative so dense? Why I'm not getting it? So ask yourself, why are you finding it dense? So and so the idea was that students would come to the class wanting to learn about how to get access to hormones and surgery and all of that. Those are also very important questions, and there are resources for that, but also to get much more out of it. And so that continuous active doing of even trans and what it means in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I love that you're all in your different ways sort of gesturing to the capaciousness of trans. So I'm so sorry that we're out of time. We have lots of questions that have not been answered. Shiv, I'm hoping that the panelists can see these questions. Can we send it to them?
Definitely. I think we'll keep this conversation alive by posting these questions to you later so that you can respond to them.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anindya, Riley, Cheyenne, for your absolutely brilliant, just, you know, really inspiring thoughts and presentations. Okay, thanks everyone. See you soon.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.